Stop everything now, because there is a nation that is shifting the balance of power in the Islamic world in 2026, a nation that most American Christians are not monitoring, a nation that geopolitical analysts are calling the new Islamic superpower, and a nation that Ezekiel 38 identified by name 2,600 years before it existed in the form it does today. Family, we're talking about Turkey. Family. When I read that Turkey is emerging as a new Islamic superpower in 2026, the first thing I felt was this. The Bible already warned about it, not vaguely but with a specific name, Beit Togarmah. Ezekiel wrote that name 2,600 years ago, and in 2026 the House of Togarmah is in the headlines as a new Islamic superpower. Family, this is not a coincidence, it's confirmation. And when I saw this, I didn't feel fear. I felt what I always feel when biblical truths manifest in the headlines, recognition, because the Bible had already said so. But before opening Ezekiel 38 in Hebrew, I need to ask you a question. Why Turkey? Why not talk about Russia, which is the nation that most prophetic studies identify with Gog of Ezekiel 38? Why not talk about Iran, which was the main threat against Israel in recent years before being weakened? Family, the answer is simple. Russia is already being monitored, Iran has already been studied, but Turkey is quietly emerging as an Islamic superpower while the eyes of the prophetic world are elsewhere. And Ezekiel 38 dedicated specific space to the territory that is now Turkey. And what Ezekiel said about this territory in the last days is now unfolding in 2026. And the world is moving towards something the prophets accurately described. All biblical truths are coming to pass. And Turkey is one of them. Stay with me, because what we're going to examine today will permanently change how you read headlines about Turkey. Before we continue, leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications now. Family, this channel exists for those who have decided they won't be swept away by headlines without understanding what God is doing. For those who want to sit down with the original biblical text in hand and study prophecy with real depth. You're not watching this video by accident. You're the kind of Christian who, when you see a headline about Turkey, doesn't skip to the next video. You stop. You research. You want to understand. Leave a like now, subscribe, and activate the bell. We'll continue. My brothers and sisters, I need to stop here for a moment. Because Turkey emerging as an Islamic superpower isn't just one of the 70 points on the prophetic map. It's one of the most significant for the current moment. But when you see all 70 points together, with each nation in its place, with the timeline showing exactly where we are now, the picture that emerges is unlike anything you've ever seen. That's why I spent months putting it all together into a single piece of work, ELAM in Flames. It's not a list of prophecies, it's a map, a complete visual guide that connects Jeremiah 49, Ezekiel 38, Daniel 9, Zechariah 12, and Revelation 18 in a timeline that any Christian can follow, with maps of the nations, with the original verses, with an explanation of where each prophecy is in the present moment, and with Turkey positioned exactly where it belongs in the larger prophetic picture. The person who holds this map in their hand doesn't watch the headlines about Turkey with confusion. They watch with genuine biblical discernment. It's in the link in the first pinned comment below. Click there now and save it. Because as this study progresses, you'll want this map close at hand. Don't close this video without getting yours. Family, I need to stop here for a second to talk to you about something important. I've noticed that the videos on this channel don't seem to be reaching people as often as they used to. It's as if some force is trying to stop this work, and we know that when the Word of God advances, the enemy works to block it. That's why we're opening a new home for our community. The channel is called Ark Bible Mystery. Go to YouTube now, search for Ark Bible Mystery, subscribe and turn on notifications. Soon this channel will be discontinued and I will only be with you there. Leave a comment saying you came to keep me company. That tells me you've arrived. We need you. Together no force will stop this work of the Lord Jesus. We continue. Open your heart to this study, family, because I'm not going to give you geopolitical analysis with a verse pasted in. I'm going to give you the original Hebrew text, cross-referenced with verifiable facts about Turkey, in August 2026. Comment below, brother, sister. Before this video, were you monitoring Turkey as part of the prophetic scenario of Ezekiel 38? Write monitoring if you already knew about Turkey's connection to Ezekiel 38. Write knew it was important, but without Hebrew depth. Or write total news if Turkey as a prophetic nation is completely new to you today. Tell me the American state where you are. I read every comment personally. Let's continue. Family, before opening Ezekiel 38, I need to give you the full geopolitical context of what is happening with Turkey in 2026. Because the biblical weight of what we are going to examine is only understandable when you understand exactly where Turkey is positioned at this moment. Turkey has the second largest army in NATO after the United States, with 355,000 active troops. It is the only Muslim nation that is a member of the world's most powerful Western military alliance. And in 2026, under Erdogan's government, Turkey is dramatically changing its orientation. Over the past 24 months, Turkey has expanded its military influence into Syria, Libya, Somalia, Azerbaijan, and the Caucasus. It is building military bases in Muslim countries around the world. It is developing advanced military drones that it sells to dozens of countries. It is leading Islamic political movements throughout the region. And geopolitical analysts are describing Turkey in 2026 as the new emerging Islamic superpower of the Middle East. Family. And here is the most impactful context. With Iran weakened by the Israeli and American strike program initiated in June 2025 and continuing into 2026, there is a power vacuum in the Islamic world. And Turkey is rapidly filling that vacuum. Erdogan is positioning himself as the new leader of the global Islamic world. And family, what makes 2026 different from other historical moments when Turkey was powerful is the simultaneous context. The Ottoman Empire was powerful for centuries, but the Ottoman Empire didn't exist after 1948. It didn't exist after Israel was gathered from many nations, as Ezekiel 38 verse 8 describes. It didn't exist with a weakened Iran creating the vacuum that Turkey is filling. What is happening with Turkey in 2026 is the growth of Beit Togarmah happening after all the conditions of Ezekiel 38 verse 8 have been created. Israel restored, gathered, dwelling securely. And it is in this context that Beit Togarmah emerges with power, as Ezekiel described. The Bible already warned. And the world is moving towards something that the prophets accurately described. Family, now let's go to the Hebrew text of Ezekiel chapter 38. Because this text is the most specific and detailed of all the prophecies about the final war against Israel in the last days. Ezekiel chapter 38 verses 1 and 2. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, set your face against Gog, of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and prophesy against him. In Hebrew, Ben Adam Sim, Panecha El Gog, Eretz, Hamagog, Nesi Rosh, Meshech, Vetuval Uhinave Alav. Family, let's go through the Hebrew word by word. Gog, the name of the prince, the leader of the coalition. Biblical scholars identify Gog as the leader of Magog's coalition. Not necessarily a specific person, but a position of geopolitical leadership. Eretz Hamagog, the land of Magog. Eretz means land, territory. Hamagog is of Magog. Biblical historians and geographers identify Magog with Russian territory. The first-century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus identified Magog with the Scythians who inhabited the territory north of the Black Sea and north of the Caucasus, which is modern Russian territory. Nesi Rosh, Prince of Rosh. Nisi means prince, leader. Rosh is interpreted by Hebrew scholars as referring to a territory in the far north. Scholars such as Wilhelm Gesenius have identified this with Russian territory since the 19th century. Meshech and Tuval, two additional territories of the coalition. Meshech is historically identified with the central Anatolia region, which is modern-day Turkey, and Tuval is historically identified with eastern Anatolia, also territory of modern-day Turkey. Family, the Hebrew text of Ezekiel 38 verse 2, already identifies two specific regions in the coalition of Gog that are geographically the territory of modern Turkey, Meshech and Tuval. Both Anatolia, both Turkey, and then verses 5 and 6 of Ezekiel 38. Persia, Ethiopia and Libya with them, all with shield and helmet, Gomer and all its troops. The house of Togarmah from the far north and all its troops. Many peoples with you. In Hebrew paras kush ve put itam kulam magen ve kova. Gomer vechol agapeha be Togarmah yarkete tzafon vechol agapeha amim rabim itach. Family, that's the word that impacts me the most when I think about Turkey emerging as an Islamic superpower in 2026. Beit Togarmah, the house of Togarmah. Beit means house, people, dynasty. Togarmah is the grandson of Noah mentioned in Genesis 10 verse 3. And Beit Togarmah, the house of Togarmah, is consistently identified by historical scholars as the people who inhabited Anatolia, which is the territory of modern-day Turkey. The family, Beit Togarmah, of Ezekiel 38 verse 6, refers to modern-day Turkey. And Yarkete Tzafon, from the far north, specifies the direction from which Togarmah comes in relation to Israel. Anatolia, the Turkish territory, lies north of Israel, exactly as Ezekiel 38 describes. And family, the detail that strikes me every time I read this verse. Beit Togarmah Yarkete Tzafon Vekhol Agapeha, the house of Togarmah from the far north and all its troops. Vekhol Agapeha means and all its military hosts, all its war contingents. Ezekiel is describing Beit Togarmah, Turkey, as an active participant in the coalition with specific military strength. And family, in 2026, Turkey will have the second largest army in NATO. It has military drones that are exported to dozens of countries. It has military bases in Syria, Libya and Somalia. Beit Togarmah Vekhol Agapeha, Turkey and all its troops, Ezekiel 38 verse 6. Written 2,600 years before 2026, the Bible already said so. Family, now let's go to verse 4 of Ezekiel 38, because this is the element that, out of all the texts in Ezekiel 38, weighed most heavily on my heart when I connected it with what is happening in Turkey now. Ezekiel 38 verse 4. And I will turn you back, and put hooks in your jaws, and bring you out with all your army. In Hebrew, Veshavav Ocha Venatati Chakim Biliciecha Vehotsetecha et Kal Chailecha. Family, when I think about what's happening with Turkey in 2026, with Erdogan expanding Turkish power, filling the vacuum left by Iran, positioning himself as the new leader of the Islamic world, political analysis says it's a rational strategy to fill a power vacuum. But the Hebrew text of Ezekiel 38 verse 4 says something much deeper. Venatati chakim biliciecha. And I will put hooks in your jaws. Chakim are hooks, barbs. Biliciecha are in your jaws, in your mouth. God puts hooks in Gog's mouth and sovereignly guides every movement. Family, this is what weighed most heavily on my heart. God has a special care for his people, and part of that care is sovereign control over every move of the nations that rise up against Israel. Erdogan may think he is building an empire, but God's hooks are in his jaws. And every decision by Turkey to expand its power is within God's sovereign plan that Ezekiel 38 described. The world is heading towards something, and God is guiding every step of that path, even the steps of the nations that rise up against his people. Family, now let's go to Genesis chapter 10 verse 3, because to understand why Togarmah is modern-day Turkey, you need to see the table of nations in Genesis 10, Genesis chapter 10 verse 3. And the sons of Gomer were Ashkenaz and Riphath and Togarmah. In Hebrew, Uvne Gomer Ashkenaz Verifat Vetogarmah. Family, Togarmah is the son of Gomer. Gomer is the son of Japheth. Japheth is the son of Noah. The table of nations in Genesis 10 is the genealogical map of the nations that derive from Noah's 3 sons. And Togarmah, son of Gomer, son of Japheth, inhabits the territory that ancient historians identified with Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey. Flavius Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, in Jewish Antiquities, Book 1, Chapter 6, explicitly identified the descendants of Togarmah with the peoples of Anatolia. And the Babylonian tractate in the Talmud identified Togarmah with Beit Turia, which is identified with Turkey. Family, the identification of Beit Togarmah with the territory of modern-day Turkey is not modern prophetic speculation. It is a historical identification dating back to the 1st century CE, and Ezekiel placed Beit Togarmah as a member of the final coalition against Israel in a text written in the 6th century BC. Family, Now let's go to verse 8 of Ezekiel 38, because this verse specifies the time and conditions of the coalition's advance. Ezekiel 38 verse 8. After many days you will be visited. At the end of the years you will come to the land that has recovered from the sword, that was gathered from many peoples, upon the mountains of Israel, that were always a desolation. But now it has been taken from the nations, and all of them dwell in safety. In Hebrew, miketz shanim tavo el eretz meshuvat cherev meguveset, meamim rabim al hare Yisrael asher hayu lechorba, tamid vehia meamim hotza veyashvu lave teach kulam. Family, let's go to Hebrew. Miketz shanim, after many days, at the end of the years, an expression of eschatological time. The hair meshuvat cherev, to the ground that recovered from the sword. Meshuvat of Shuv, returned, restored. Cherev, sword. The land of Israel devastated by war and now recovering. Meguveset memim rabim, gathered from many nations. Meguveset of Gavats, gathered, assembled. Memim rabim, from many nations. Jews from 134 nations returning to Israel since 1948. Veyashvu lavetich kulam, and they all dwell in safety. The context of Israel in relative safety as the Gog coalition advances. Family, all the conditions described in Ezekiel 38 verse 8 have been met since 1948. Israel restored, gathered, dwelling in safety. And it is in this context that Beit Togarmah emerges as an Islamic superpower. The Bible already warned. Every condition that Ezekiel 38 verse 8 describes as preceding the advance of Gog is present in 2026. Family, now verse 13 of Ezekiel 38. Because this verse describes the world's reaction to the advance of Gog, and the world's reaction in 2026 to the growth of Turkey's Islamic superpower is prophetically revealing. Ezekiel 38 verse 13. Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish with all their young lions will say to you, have you come to take the spoil? Family, Sheba and Dedan are territories of the Arabian Peninsula, and the merchants of Tarshish, whom many identify with the Western commercial powers, only ask verbal questions of Gog's advance. Aviata labach, have you come to take spoils? It is the weakest possible reaction to an invasion, no military intervention, no defensive alliance, only verbal protests. Family, in 2026, while Turkey expands its military power into Syria, Libya, Azerbaijan and Somalia, the reaction of the Western world has been exactly this. Statements of concern, diplomatic questioning, but no effective intervention to contain Turkish expansionism. The Bible already said it would be like this. Everything takes a second. Because I need to ask you a direct question before continuing. Are you the type of Christian who, when you see headlines about Turkey emerging as an Islamic superpower, gets confused about what that means prophetically? Or are you the type who opens Ezekiel 38 verse 6, reads, Beit Togarmah Yarkete Tzafon Vekhol Agapeha, and understands exactly what is happening? This difference isn't one of intelligence, it's one of tools. Those who have the map don't get lost. Those who don't have the map, even if they want to understand, remain dependent on someone else to explain. ELAM in Flames was made precisely to give you this map. 70 prophecies, one by one, each verse in the original, each nation identified, each current event connected to the corresponding biblical text. And there's more. The prophetic timeline within the material shows exactly where we are in those 70 prophecies now. Beit Togarmah is mapped. The coalition of Ezekiel 38 is mapped. Where Turkey fits in is mapped. When you finish studying this material, you will read headlines about Turkey in a completely different way, not with confusion, with biblical accuracy. The link is in the first pinned comment below. Play it now, download yours, then come back here, there's still a lot to see. Family, here are 7 prophetic parallels between Turkey emerging as an Islamic superpower in 2026 and the Beit Togarmah pattern described in Ezekiel 38. I present these as pastoral observations of verifiable convergence, not as declarations of definitive fulfillment. Parallel 1. Beit Togarmah and its historical identification with Turkey. The identification of Beit Togarmah from Ezekiel 38 verse 6 with the territory of modern Turkey is not modern speculation. It is a historical identification dating back to the 1st century historian Flavius Josephus, who identified the descendants of Togarmah with the peoples of Anatolia, which is Turkey. Turkey emerging as an Islamic superpower in 2026 is beat Togarmah from Ezekiel 38, increasing its military capacity and its projection of regional power. Pastoral observation. Turkey in 2026 is growing exactly in the power profile that Ezekiel 38 verse 6 describes for Beit Togarmah as an active military participant in the coalition of Gog. The Bible had already said so. Parallel 2. Vekol Agapeha and Turkish military capacity. Ezekiel 38 verse 6 specifies Beit Togarmah Vekol Agapeha, the house of Togarmah and all its military hosts. In 2026, Turkey has the second largest army in NATO, a military drone industry that exports to dozens of countries and military bases in multiple Muslim countries. The specific military capacity that Ezekiel 38 verse 6 attributes to Beit Togarmah is present in Turkey in 2026 in a way without historical precedent. Pastoral observation. The Turkish military expansion of 2026 converges with the profile of Vekol Agapeha that Ezekiel 38 describes for Beit Togarmah. Parallel 3. Çakim Bilicyecha and divine sovereignty over Erdogan. Ezekiel 38 verse 4 describes God placing Çakim hooks in the mouth of Gog and sovereignly guiding his movements. God has a special care for his people, Israel, and part of that care is sovereign control over every movement of the nations that rise up against Israel. Erdogan may think he is building an empire, but God's hooks are in his jaws, and every decision by Erdogan to expand Turkish power is a divine hook positioning Beit Togarmah exactly where Ezekiel said it would be. Pastoral observation. God's sovereignty over Turkey's movements is more real than any geopolitical analysis that ignores Ezekiel 38 verse 4. Parallel 4. Meshech and Tuval and the additional Turkish territory. Besides Beit Togarmah, Ezekiel 38 verse 2 identifies Meshech and Tuval as part of the coalition of Gog. Historical scholars identify Meshech with Cappadocia, Central Anatolia, and Tuval with Eastern Anatolia. Both are modern Turkish territory. Ezekiel 38 therefore identifies three distinct geographical references that correspond to the territory of modern Turkey: Meshech, Tuval, and Beit Togarmah. Pastoral observation. The triplicate presence of Turkish territory in Ezekiel 38 indicates that Turkey has a central, not peripheral role in the coalition of Gog. Parallel 5. Miketz Shanim and the climate of the last days. Ezekiel 38 verse 8 situates the advance of Gog in Miketz Shanim at the end of the years in eschatological time, and verse 16 uses Ba-Charit Hayamim, at the end of days. The growth of Turkey's Islamic superpower in 2026 happens after 1948, after the gathering of Israel from many peoples, after the restoration of the state of Israel described in verse 8, all the conditions that Ezekiel 38 places before the advance of Geogi are present. Pastoral observation. The growth of Turkish power in 2026 happens in the exact temporal context that Ezekiel 38 describes for the positioning of Beit Togarmah before the great conflict. The Bible has already warned, parallel 6, the powerless reaction of the nations in Ezekiel 38 verse 13. The reaction of Sheba, Dedan, and the merchants of Tarshish to the advance of Gog is only verbal protests without effective intervention. In 2026, while Turkey expands its military power, the reaction of Western powers has been declarations of concern without effective military action to contain Turkish expansionism. The pattern of verbal impotence of nations in the face of the growth of Beit Togarmah converges with the pattern of Ezekiel 38 verse 13. Pastoral observation. The inability of Western powers to contain Turkish expansion converges with the pattern of reaction that Ezekiel 38 verse 13 describes. Parallel 7. Divine judgment on Gog as pastoral assurance. Ezekiel 38 verses 19-23 describe divine judgment on the coalition of Gog, including Beit Togarmah. A great earthquake, fire and brimstone, confusion among the members of the coalition, and all nations acknowledging that the Lord is God, Ve'adu ki ani Adonai. Regardless of how much power Turkey accumulates, regardless of how large the coalition of Gog becomes, The end of Ezekiel 38 is not victory for Gog. It is divine judgment that reveals God's sovereignty over all Islamic superpowers and over any coalition that rises against Israel. Pastoral observation. Turkey may emerge as an Islamic superpower, but the God of Ezekiel 38 has already written the end of the history of Beit Togarmah. And God has a special care for his people. Family, 7 verifiable parallels. Beit Togarmah and the historical identification with Turkey. Vekol Agapeha and Turkish military capacity. Chakim Biliciecha and divine sovereignty over Erdogan. Meshech and Tuval and additional Turkish territory. Miketz Shanim and the time of the last days. The impotent reaction of nations. And divine judgment as a pastoral guarantee over any superpower that rises against Israel. If you've made it this far, you're already part of a small group. Most people don't watch videos like this until the end. Not because it's not important, but because the level of depth isn't for everyone. You've come this far. And the Christian who has come this far, who now knows the Beit Togarmah of Ezekiel 38 verse 6, who understands the Chakim Biliciecha of divine sovereignty over Erdogan, who has seen Meshech and Tuval identified with Turkish territory, and who knows the divine judgment of Ezekiel 38 verses 19 to 23 upon the entire coalition of Gog, that Christian deserves to have the complete map. ELAM in Flames was prepared specifically for you, for the Christian who wants more than just a headline with a verse pasted on, for the Christian who wants to sit down with the text in hand and understand it, for the Christian who wants to be prepared when those around them panic about the growth of Turkish power in the Islamic world. Inside the material, you will find the 70 prophecies that are unfolding simultaneously, a visual map of the nations involved, a timeline showing where we are now, the original Hebrew and Greek texts with explanations, and the connection of each prophecy to what is in the headlines today, including Beit Togarmah emerging as an Islamic superpower in 2026. Click the link in the first pinned comment below. Download now. Don't put it off. The map is waiting for you. Before you go, do 2 things. Leave a like now, and go to the Ark Bible Mystery channel on YouTube, search for it, subscribe, and turn on notifications. That's where our community continues. And to conclude this family study, if you are an American Christian and are afraid of the growth of Islamic power in the world, of the growth of Turkey, of the axis of nations rising up against Israel, I need to tell you something with direct pastoral love. Every Christian must be ready, not tomorrow, now, because the day of the Lord will come, and the Bible has already warned that this would happen before. But family, the Christian who knows Ezekiel 38 doesn't read about Turkey emerging as an Islamic superpower with fear. They read with recognition, because they know the end of the story. Ezekiel 38 verse 23 already declared the outcome, Ve'adu ki ani Adonai, and they will know that I am the Lord. It is not the Islamic superpower that will prevail. It is the recognition that God is the Lord. Lift up your head. Luke 21 verse 28. Family, when I think about the end that Ezekiel 38 promised for Gog and Beit Togarmah, the great earthquake, the fire and brimstone, the confusion among the nations, and all nations recognizing that God is the Lord, what I feel is total confirmation. Because every biblical truth that is happening now, Turkey emerging as an Islamic superpower, the coalition of Ezekiel 38 forming, the divine hooks in the jaws of the nations, all of this is the world moving in the direction that God had already described. And God has a special care for his people, and the end of the story of Beit Togarmah is not an Islamic superpower. It is Vehit Gadilti Vehit Kadishti, I will magnify myself and sanctify myself. God is coming back, and I want to be ready for that moment, and I want every person who watches this channel to be ready too. The end of the story of Beit Togarmah is not an Islamic superpower. It is the recognition that God is the Lord. And that recognition, which Ezekiel 38 verse 23 promised to all nations, including Turkey, is the pastoral assurance that the American Christian needs to read the headlines about Turkey emerging as an Islamic superpower without fear. The Bible already warned us. God has a special care for his people, and God is coming back. In the next video, we will open Ezekiel 39 in its entirety and show what happens to the coalition of Gog including Biat Togama, after the divine judgment, and what Ezekiel 39 describes as the final outcome of Gog's war against Israel will surprise many American Christians. Ark Bible Mystery. Search now, subscribe. See you there.